Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening and tuning into this podcast conversation. My name is Jodie Williams, and I am with the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Today, I am in conversation with Ziyanda Stuurman, the author of Can We Be Safe? The Future of Policing in South Africa. Welcome to you, Ziyanda. Thank you so much for joining us in conversation today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Jodie. I'm really looking forward to this.
So am I. I read your book over the last couple of weeks. Definitely one of the best reads I've had in a long time.
Thank you.
I've made a couple of initial observations that I think we can sort of jump straight into.
Great.
One of the first observations I made in the first few chapters of your book was that you delved into some of your personal reflections on your upbringing and what notions of safety meant to you growing up. Mm-hmm. This idea of like having to be vigilant, this idea of having to look out for yourself and having to look out for others. I want to know from you, to what extent did your personal experiences of safety influence your research and ultimately influence your writing of this book?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question in terms of, what I was trying to achieve while writing the book as well, right? And not wanting to be clinical about it and kind of saying or putting myself out of my writing or out of even the research process. So I early on in the book, I talk about something that's always stood out to me in the sense that when I've got my very first car, my father, I've grown up between Gugulethu and George. And if you know Gugulethu pretty well, it's a fairly an old and established township, but it has a fair amount of crime and violence in it as well. Not necessarily the same sort of levels as the Cape Flats or Khayelitsha or other areas, but certainly it's still pretty unsafe in parts. And my father was quite adamant when we got the car. He was like, I'm going to drive it around for a couple of weeks, and with the hope that people think that it's mine, with the intention being that, and then they know not to mess, with you and with the car, etc. And it hadn't clicked to me until he had said that actually that's like a form of creating your own safety. And I, talk about in the book that there's a police station in Gugulethu that's in a highly visible part, of the community, but the police officers themselves are not visible. And so that's how you then compensate for that. You essentially have earned respect and you have sort of family connections. And so everybody then knows, okay, this is somebody who's part of our community. This whole family has been part of our community for a long time. We don't mess with them. And it was just such an eye-opening sort of experience to, again, this having to compensate for this lack of safety and security, but finding your own way to do so. And then moving to Sea Point was a completely different sort of change, where, again, the police station there is also in a highly visible part of the community, and police officers themselves patrol a lot more often than I had ever seen police officers patrol in Gugulethu. But at the same time, had the same sort of disdain for their job. And when we did have somebody break into our apartment at the time and steal my housemate's, it was like a Mac desktop, which is a lot of money. I mean, it's a high value item, and they just very sort of lackadaisical, kind of swept forward for fingerprints, not really interested. Nothing ever really happened. I don't think any of us really thought they were going to get, the desktop back. And my friend then needed a case number, got insurance paid out, and we all went about our lives. And so those very personal experiences of crime and insecurity all, I think, came into the book. And that's why I definitely was also writing from an aspect of, I've had some contact with the police. I'm lucky enough that I'm middle class, that I haven't had lots of that contact. But I also understand that those of us who do have contact with the police sometimes aren't, we're not middle class mostly, and sometimes aren't also at risk of being brutalized by the police in the same way that a lot of poor people are. Victimized, brutalized, ignored, dismissed, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those experiences, I think, at least for the very first part of the book, really kind of built that bridge. But just generally across the book, I think also informed the way that I wrote.
Yeah, no, that definitely came through, and I think it really enriched your perspective and enriched the reading journey as well. Often when we look at sort of text, especially sort of academic text, it can come across very clinical, sometimes even alienating. And I think what you've successfully been able to do with kickstarting your book with these sort of personal reflections, but also personal interactions with the police, recognizing the ways in which, you are somehow privileged or protected from the worst of police brutality, police violence, but also policing inefficiencies. So, Ziyanda, the next point I wanted to draw your attention to would be the sort of historical contextualization that you go into quite in-depthly in the beginning of your book, where you sort of trace our history of colonial era policing, but also apartheid era policing, and you did so very comprehensively. For me, in my work in social justice, historical contextualization remains very critical because I find that history, particularly our history in South Africa, continues to inform our present and continues to inform the social inequities and particularly the socioeconomic inequalities that we've inherited from our past. My question to you then is, why was grounding your research in these historical underpinnings so important, and particularly, as I've mentioned, around colonial era policing and apartheid era policing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely a big part of that is just my own interest. So I took history all the way through through school, in high school, and then I minored in history at university in my undergrad, and that has always, I think, really helped me understand just the world around me. This whole idea that anything that's happened usually hasn't happened in isolation, probably hasn't happened for the first time, ever, and definitely hasn't happened for the first time in like global human history. So it was about really understanding that everything that we know about our police service feels like it's new, it's current, it's relevant, it's timely, et cetera, But I think it's, I wanted to really make the point that the way that we have set up our police service and the way that the institution runs is centuries old. It's not new. It's not brand new. It didn't, originate out of nowhere. And later in the book, I try and draw global connections to policing, but also especially colonial era policing and especially British colonial policing. So in that sense, I really wanted us to take a long, long view of what policing looked like in the 16, 17, 1800s to help us understand why it looks the way that it does now and just how difficult it is to reform an institution like policing. Or then, again, an argument that I make, can we reform it? If something is that old, it's that deeply steeped in racism and, colonialism and apartheid eventually and sort of these incredibly harmful forms of social control. Can we actually unravel that? Like, is that something that we want to do? And then obviously that leads to the larger question of the book, can we be safe? Can we trust and sort of put out our trust and faith in policing the way that we've always done it, and always, like big sort of red, bold, underlined, under always. Can we actually then say that we'll ever get to a measure of security or safety or community safety or feelings of everybody being safe and equally so, if we really are still relying on this incredibly old, dark, ugly sort of tradition and practice of policing and community safety.
Yeah, a practice of policing that is inherently violent in its conception and in its in the way it continues today, right? So I want to kind of bring your attention now to our transition of the 1990s, generally a period of time in South Africa's history that I personally am quite critical of. the manner in which we transitioned politically and the idea of a negotiated transition. And you speak extensively how even policing as an institution, that our transition was one that was also negotiated. My question to you then is, in your opinion, what were some of the critical challenges that we faced during our transition, specifically relating to police reform?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think there are many ways to sort of answer it. I think that there are many kind of points at which the project was, if not doomed, then critically undermined. So I think one of the important parts of that is sort of understanding that I think it was in 1995 or 96, and it was a speech that Nelson Mandela gave, President Nelson Mandela at the time gave in Parliament, and he was very obviously trying to reassure, the country and particularly the sort of security forces at the time that included the police, that this wasn't going to be a complete 180 in terms of what policing looks like, and trying to keep some sense or form of stability within the police service. And he used the words, I'm sort of paraphrasing the quote, but he essentially used the words and said, this is not going to be a witch hunt, of the sort of process of reform won't be a witch hunt. And that to me was just, you can't call accountability a witch hunt, because that's what it was. It was about, essentially saying that we need to root out these incredibly racist and dangerous elements of the police service that literally hounded, killed, harassed, brutalized, maimed, tortured so many people who are part of our liberation struggle. You can't actually say to them that, number one, either nothing is going to happen or there's going to be no real accountability, or then call that accountability a witch hunt. It was incredibly, incredibly necessary. And so when you're making reassurances like that to people, and to me, then conceding far too much, you're kind of setting the whole process up for failure in many ways. So that was one sort of key part of it. Another was around sort of changing the, makeup of the police service, but I think on a very not necessarily on a granular level, but more of a like an external sort of outsider's view. So it's about changing the name of the police from the SAP or South African Police to the South African Police Service, and I completely understood that. And then trying to inculcate, a more community-oriented, human rights-based approach to policing. But if you just say that and you don't do it, does it actually ever happen? Does it actually ever manifest? And so there were just like a couple of points in those sort of early years of just undermining, I think a lot of government officials and police officials undermining their own efforts that, eventually led to a situation where at the station level and with individual police officers who had started off their careers in the 70s, 80s, or maybe earlier, who just kind of felt like, okay, well, nothing's actually going to change. Where there's all this talk of this change, but are we actually going to change? Oh, no. And that then unfortunately led to a situation where when, crime rates picked up again, especially in the 2000s, and everybody was frustrated by again, those rising crime levels, which also had a lot to do with the fact that a police service that had only served the white minority for a really, really long time, and that was actually more engaged in the political suppression of the country, not actually community safety, now had to serve the entire country and had to stretch itself into rural areas and townships and places that it had never been before. And all of this is happening at the same time that we've opened our borders. And so organized crime networks are now, becoming part of the drug trade and many other things in South Africa. The country was awash with weapons from the liberation struggle, both from the army, but also from other sort of militant forces and all of these other things, including then at that point the crime that comes with high inequality and high levels of unemployment. All of those things came together to raise crime levels, and at the same time raise the public's frustration with crime. And that's when the police then backslid into their old ways of doing policing, where they kind of went, well, this whole like human rights-based thing is not working out, so we're just gonna go ahead and like stop doing that. and I was on a panel discussion a couple of months ago where I also made the really important point that a lot of what really dictates police culture is also station commanders. So, we talk a lot about like high-level police officials like national commissioners, police ministers, et cetera, but we sometimes forget that literal station commanders, wherever they go, really set the tone for an individual police station and those police officers who are there, especially the more junior police officers. And so if you have people who don't believe in a type of approach that is community-oriented, that is human rights based, that does respect the community and different people who are in it, then you end up in a situation where any sort of ethos that you do have isn't lived out. And that's for good and bad. There are some good police officers who are out there. There are some good police leaders and station commanders who are out there. They're just few and far between.
Thanks for that point, particularly because often, in our work, we sometimes think of systems, oppressive systems. We think of oppressive institutional cultures as these abstract things. But actually, there are people who make up those systems. There are people who reinforce and practice those cultures. And I think highlighting that point for me really drives that point home. But before I get into that, I wanted to sort of ask you about your language in the book, a very important question that I have to put out there. In your book, whenever you really spoke about disenfranchised people, disenfranchised communities, those who bear the brunt of police violence, those who are unfairly perceived as criminal due to their race, due to their socioeconomic background, those who are more likely to experience crime, but also those who are more likely to be policed very differently, as you say in your book. When you speak of those disenfranchised people and those disenfranchised groups, you specifically make mention of Black, colored, and Indian communities. I wanted to know, was that a deliberate language choice and language usage on your part? And why did you think it was important to be so specific about the communities that you are speaking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was definitely deliberate on my part. I didn't want to, make it a catch-all and say people of color. I didn't want to, sort of shorten it and say BCI or anything else. I very much wanted to be extremely deliberate about who I was speaking about. And also, I very much used the terms working class and poor as well, and sort of talked about low-income communities, et cetera. Because I think that we need to be very precise about who we're speaking about and who we're sort of talking about. And not every single Black, colored, and Indian person or working class and poor person is necessarily going to be treated exactly the same way. There are many other intersecting identities even within that I think have a way of essentially making it so that we experience this country differently. But I really didn't want there to be any ambiguity about who I was speaking about and which communities I was talking about. And so those communities are your Khayelichas, your Nyangas, your Delfts, your Vrygrond, Mitchell's Plain, Bonteville, etc. So I really wanted people to visualize that and then understand which communities, I was speaking of, and also including Phoenix. And I know for some people it becomes like controversial when you're like, oh, did you really mean Indian communities? Yes, I do. I really do. I think it's really important to understand that like people of color, of course, have I say now people of color, but Black, colored, and Indian communities had very many stratified experiences, even especially during apartheid and still today, especially in their socioeconomic circumstances. But I really wanted to be quite deliberate about where I was speaking about, those different communities. And I think even to give a practical example, in the book I talk about a small community in the Eastern Cape called Patterson, small rural community there. And an ethnographer's work who I refer to, Andrew Fall, he speaks about at night where the police are patrolling that neighborhood, and they're sort of raiding and really quite harassing young black and colored men specifically. And that's exactly what I was talking about, like in that community. In the same way that, where there are raids on the Cape Flats, they always target young colored men. And the idea that like they must be associated with gangsterism for, obviously many reasons, but really largely to do with their race and the way that they dress and the way that they associate with people and who they associate with. So I really didn't want there to be any ambiguity that it was like young men who are being targeted. There's like a group specifically, I think, of young men in different areas who are targeted, and we need to be quite clear about that.
I really appreciated that about your work, your research, and your writing, in that you were so deliberately specific about who it is you were speaking about. And for me, I do sense a generational difference in that. I think, some generations who have come before us, sometimes there is this tendency to talk around, these very difficult, very sensitive issues that we are constantly confronted with in our society and in our various communities. And I think, here comes a generation of, so-called born frees who no longer want to sort of beat around the bush, who really want to call a spade a spade. And I think that really pushes our conversations and our mobilizations for social justice forward when we're able to name problems as we see them, because then that helps us to firstly understand those issues, and then also helps us to address them in the way that we need to. From a dialogue perspective, as someone who, engages in critical dialogue on racial injustice and just, the lived experience of what it means to experience racism, I often encounter people sometimes, or more often than not, of a very particular socioeconomic group, with a very particular history, possibly a history of being privileged, possibly a descendant of those who were direct beneficiaries of apartheid. I often encounter the sentiment of needing to move on, needing to move past this reification of race or this classification of race, right? And sometimes I find that sentiment incredibly damaging. Especially when we look at where we are and when we look at how those racial hierarchies are still very much entrenched in our society and in our various communities. So for me, your deliberate use of language really made me think of the sentiment and this privilege, really, of what it means to say we need to move on, right? And your book, as I said, being grounded so firmly in the sort of historical contextualization really supported the sentiment for me. I want to kind of segue into your writing on the criminalization of poor, working class, black and colored people by the police and by other institutions in our criminal justice system. How, in your opinion, how does our triple challenge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality exacerbate these conditions and these subsequent lived realities where just because you are poor, just because you are working class, just because you are black and colored, that you will then be perceived as criminal and subsequently treated and dehumanized based purely on those factors of being or existing under poverty, existing in a space of unemployment and inequality in our society.
I think that question is so great because it gets to the heart of an argument that I try to weave throughout the entire book around the idea that I think especially in our cities, but in very many of our communities, we see and we treat each other not just as strangers, not just as people we don't necessarily know or people we haven't had a chance to meet, but as dangerous strangers. We're constantly looking at each other as, what could Jody do to me? What could, the next person in the street do to me if I leave myself vulnerable or if I let my guard down around them? And that guard or that view is also extremely classist. It's very, very racist, and it's very steeped in this history of who we think of as a criminal, right? So an example becomes Oscar Pistorius, for example, who talks about like this unnamed, faceless sort of black intruder that he thought was in his home, and that's how he to himself, and we're never going to know the like full truth of what he was thinking, but to himself, he thought, this is who I need to protect myself against, and so was really quite gung ho in terms of shooting through a door and not seeing who was on the other side and killing someone. Similarly, again, with, I think his name was Henry van Breda in Stellenbosch, also using that very same excuse of this like nameless, faceless, but really black intruder, and then trying to justify his violence and his murders in that sense. So those are extreme examples of what I'm talking about. But basically, when we're out there and we find ourselves in situations where we're either scared or or we feel insecure in a place or an area, we're actually almost always thinking about the same type of person over and over again. And that has to do with media narratives, it has to do with socialization, but it also has to do with our own ideas of, who is criminal, what is criminal, where are they criminal, etc. And that just really then feeds into this idea that poor and working class people especially are more prone to being criminal. And so we should be more afraid of them than we are of anybody else. And really, in that sense, I think that's what drives so much of this view that, and it particularly, I think, drives this view of very, very harmful and harsh policing practices, that in any way that we feel unsafe, it should be that the police are going into those communities and they're shutting down whatever it is, or that they should be looking for the criminals there, when, the criminals could be living literally next door to us.
Yeah.
So it's again, that idea that I think another really good example is of when there was gang violence and the spike in violent crime in the Cape Flats, and how everybody cheered when the military went into a lot of those communities, and essentially, in a really harsh way, occupied a lot of those communities for weeks on end. And that being said, that's the best way to solve violent crime, in those areas, and shutting down other solutions and other really long-term solutions. I think that could have helped with exactly those problems. Everybody was happy to cheer those on, but particularly from the middle class, happy to cheer that on, because then it allows us to say there isn't, or either that there isn't violence in our own communities, or in our own suburbs, or that violence is because there's violence or there are criminals in those communities. And so, yes, the military should absolutely go there. And then at the same time would freak out if they ever saw a military armed vehicle coming down their driveway or down their street. So why is it? And I really wanted to complicate that question and ask people, why is it that you're okay with really harsh, incredibly brutal forms of policing under the guise of creating community safety in those communities, when you would never be okay with it for yourself, ever? Yeah. So why should people live under that terror of the military and the police at the very same time when they're living under the terror of being victims of crime themselves? Mm. Why would it ever be okay for them to experience all of those things, and for you to just, that's not in my neighborhood, not in my suburb. It would never happen. So exactly,
you've touched on a number of critical points, and I'll be sure to circle back to some of them. I'm really glad you brought up the military, because in your book you kind of sound the alarm on the normalization of military presence in community life, in public space, and in civic life, really. For me, when I see the military out in communities, as a historian myself, just like you, I think back to our very recent history of military presence, whether that be in townships or in Black and colored communities, and the violence and the trauma that came with that during particularly the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, where the apartheid regime basically was a militarized state. And now, reflecting on that painful history of military presence in our communities, how the apartheid regime was, significantly reliant on the armed forces to maintain control of Black people, to squash resistance against the unjust apartheid regime, and to essentially uphold apartheid. For me, that history and the trauma that comes with that is clearly very evident and very present still in community life. And now, again, I refer to, I suppose, a new generation of young people born into a so-called democracy, right? Who then now still see military presence and the brutality and the trauma that comes with that as part of community life, right? Why, given these contradictions and given the similarities between our apartheid past and our democratic present, why, in your opinion, was it so important that your book really sounds that alarm on this normalization of military, of the military in our communities?
Yeah, I think so. What I immediately wanted to do, and sort of interesting, the life span of this book really kind of started back in 2017 when I did a master's degree in security studies, and I had immediately wanted to focus on just this idea that the military was now becoming a catch-all solution to a multitude of different social ills, and chief amongst them being crime. So the military being rolled out during Operation Fiela in 2015 against xenophobic violence. Then the military, similarly calls for the military for almost a decade. Before that, also being around, bring the military in to solve gang violence, on the Cape Flats, and then it actually happening in 2019. And I mean, I just remember being so exasperated, just being like, this is what I, wrote and sort of have spoken to so many people about, that we cannot possibly think that deploying the military domestically, I don't think people realize how absolutely bizarre it is that we're deploying the military domestically within our own borders to take care of crime issues or issues related to crime, and also again, social issues, including xenophobia, when the police should be doing that work. Mm-hmm. It's we're even undermining the police themselves by saying that the military should be doing this work when they absolutely are not trained to do so. They're not equipped to do so. They're not equipped to engage with communities. They are trained and equipped to engage with combatants and with enemies. And so that's like one part of it, and that sort of thread that I then put out on Twitter about my thesis and about a lot of those findings in 2019 in response to the military being rolled out, went viral, and I wrote a couple of op-eds, and I was trying to explain to people that this is just really not the way to go. And if we're even trying to look outside of our borders for examples of where this has failed catastrophically, then Mexico and Brazil and the Philippines and other countries that have tried to use the military to fight back their issues around gang and drug violence, that's failed spectacularly, and for a reason. And so I don't think we're going to be any different. And I think, the past 2 years have shown us that that's absolutely not the case. So I really just wanted to sound that alarm, but also to really say to people that I think one of the main reasons why this feels like a solution is because it's also been sold as a solution by a lot of politicians. I'm not going to give her the airtime by saying her name, but a particular politician from the governing party in the Western Cape has beat this drum over and over over and over again. And so it started to sound like it was necessarily communities or community activists themselves who were calling for the military, when in fact, and I go out of my way in the book to detail multiple instances of community activists saying, yes, we had some faith that this might work, that, military deployment in 2011 or in 2015 or in 2019 might work. But basically that it hasn't, because again, the military are not trained to engage and to engage the community, first of all, but also to help in any real way with the police work that's necessary to dismantle these gangs and these criminal networks. But also just largely where the community themselves, have said, again, we thought this might be a solution. It's not. It's not a long-term solution. So we need something that's long-term, because we'll just keep cycling through these, spikes in violent crime and these incredibly high murder rates just over and over and over again, and we'll need more military each time, and it's not working. So it really was just about challenging this idea that, number one, the community is the one calling for this, or calling for military deployment, and that's not to say that some community members aren't. They definitely are, but there are many who are just as critical of the fact that this has happened before and it's failed before, and we really need to get to a point where any solution that's brought in is long term.
Thanks for that. Your point on, the military and their shortcomings in community policing and specifically human rights policing. I'm immediately drawn to a part of your book where I'm not sure if you personally interviewed a member of the South African National Defence Force, but one of the statements that kind of ring in the back of my mind was a soldier who said, soldiers are trained to win battles. And then he goes on to speak about this idea of skop en donder. So that was a statement that really stuck with me while reading the book and really pointed to this idea of the military being trained for war, for combat, and now being called into situations and basically being called to respond to socioeconomic and political crises, not necessarily issues of combat and war, right? So that really came through very strongly in your book. And this idea of re-traumatization with military presence in our communities, where violence continues to run on the circular loop, really stuck out for me. I want to then now, as part of my next conversation, you mentioned the Western Cape, and I really want us to spend some time talking about the city we find ourselves in this morning, the city of Cape Town, which continues to be a city that internationally is known as this world tourist destination, right? Whenever you say to people from wherever in the world, oh, I'm from Cape Town, they usually remember the tourist pamphlet, if you will, about what Cape Town is.
The mountains, the sea.
Exactly. But you and I are Cape Town locals, and I think we definitely know the city a little bit differently to what potentially our local leaders would like to, showcase to the world, right? Cape Town, just like many other cities in our country, we find situations where the poor, where Black, colored people are heavily policed, and how, racial inequality really underpins this phenomenon. We also find a situation where immigrants, Black foreigners specifically from different parts of the African continent, where they are the ones who really bear the brunt of violent policing, while the wealthy in our city, those who can afford to, like you say in your book, buy protection, while they live and exist in these bubbles of comfort, right? A very stark contrast of what it means to be white, middle class, and what it means to be Black and working class, right? Very different experiences of Cape Town. And I think, circling back to the Khayelitsha Commission, for example, I think that was one of the examples that really shed light on these very stark and deep inequities within our city. On the Khayelitsha Commission, can you perhaps reflect on some of the key structural issues that came out of the commission? And then I'm hoping that, reflecting on this could potentially help us understand how other under-resourced communities, structurally neglected communities, as you say in your book, on the flats and around the country, how they are themselves grappling with these inequities in policing. What did this commission really uncover about some of our most pressing policing issues in the country today?
I think that the Khayelitsha Commission was just so incredibly powerful in doing, many, many things. I think the work of the Social Justice Coalition and other sister organizations to get the commission in place in the first place was just so deeply, deeply important and profound, because I think that it laid the groundwork for this commission to do the work of uncovering just how much policing as a system and as a practice and as an institution has failed so many of our poor communities. So Khayelitsha was one community, but it was, I think, emblematic and representative of so many others who are going through very, very similar issues and who are being failed by the police in very, very similar ways. So the commission itself was deeply powerful and important in terms of uncovering. So we think we know, for example, that policing is inefficient and it fails and it's, terrible, but we don't actually know the granular ways in which that really, really touches, but also really harms people's lives. So it's it was everything around the fact that so many of the police stations that are in and around Khayelitsha are deeply under-resourced, where, there are not enough police personnel, and where there are personnel, they don't have any of the tools, the basic tools to do their job. I'm immediately thinking of an example of the testimony. So there were about 80 people, 80 community members and experts, policing experts, and also police officials who testified during the commission. And one of the examples that I think it was a police official who had given said that in Khayelitsha, the police officers there are so under-resourced that when the police officers are there, when somebody calls a crime in and they're called out somewhere, and where they're lucky enough to even have a vehicle that can take them out to where they need to be, they then get to a scene and they might need to either call for backup or call for other sort of specialist service like a pathologist or somebody else to come onto the scene. They then don't have airtime, so they don't have the basic resources to be able to do their jobs, or there's no proper functional police radio network or communication that they can use to call in auxiliary services. And that's just one tiny example of the many, many things that are just wrong really with the way that policing in Khayelitsha works. I mean, Khayelitsha is a large community, and it's ever growing and it's very dynamic. And at the time of the commission, there was essentially only one police station that was meant to serve this entire community, when there were meant to be satellite police stations in Harare B, in Samora Machel, and in other parts of that community that just were non-existent or under-resourced to the point of being non-existent. So it was very much along those lines of the fact that even where police resources existed, they just were so ineffective, and there were so few of them. And then on top of that, it created a frustration and incredibly low morale for individual police officers, where they, are there, but they can't really help anybody, to the point where their own attitudes harden towards their job and to the community. And they just say, I can't help you. Or actually, I don't want to help you. They're constantly sort of put in danger themselves by having to go out and to do a very dangerous job, and not having any real backing that they need to be able to do their job. That it really becomes a question of, even to them, even to police officers, where they have to ask themselves, am I here, for the right reasons? Am I going to be able to make a difference? And am I willing to put myself, really at risk of harm and of fatal harm every single day when I know that this institution doesn't care about me, doesn't have my back, and hasn't resourced me? And we're human. I mean, that we should be able to empathize with and to really say, would we, if we were in the exact same position, would we do more? Could we even expect, people to do more? So that was one of the really, really important things, or part of the many important things that came out of the commission. It was really understanding in very, very specific detail just how the police fail the community of Khayelitsha, but also how that's actually a microcosm and representative of how many other communities around the country are being failed by non-existent or inadequate police resources. And it's really sad to say that not much has changed after that. There were 20 recommendations that were put forward by the two commissioners, Advocate Vusi Pikoli and Judge Cato Regan, and they just kind of have dissipated in very, very many ways because there was no real political will to change after all of this happened. I think that there was a lot of evasiveness on the part of the police service themselves, especially the Western Cape, provincial police department or service, in terms of responding to, what was happening within the commission. And at the time, specifically, the police minister, Natim Tetwa, was being the quintessential politician in terms of turning all of this around and saying that both the SJC and at the time Premier Helen Zille, who, using her authority sort of instituted this commission, then said that they were playing politics when he himself was clearly playing politics by trying to say that, by trying to say that because this whole process is political, so from the very get-go, there's nothing here to talk about, there's nothing, we should be doing, there's no need for this commission. And so it's just really frustrating to know that this is how politics and the politics of policing, but also the politics of blame, just absolutely harm people's lives in very, very material and very real ways.
Yeah, that's such an important point to really drive home because all this politicking and blame shifting, as you say, that has real life consequences for people who are in this community, people who are struggling, fighting, surviving, right? In a context where we are dealing with historical trauma, present day trauma, but then also structural violence through poverty, through unemployment, etc. So Ziyanda, in recent years, we've seen international or global mass mobilization around this issue of police brutality and specifically in Black communities. And here I'll specifically refer to the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think has been instrumental in keeping this critical issue front of mind. In your opinion, to what extent has the discourse, but also the conversation and mobilization by the Black Lives Matter movement, to what extent has that influenced local understandings of police brutality, but also local mobilizations against police brutality?
That's a really good question. I think that there are very few countries that experience sort of similar levels of racist police brutality that, haven't been influenced by the movement for Black lives. I think that it's been so important for us to understand what policing looks like in the US because there's, I think, an incredibly idealized, and was for a long time, I think that the facade has broken a little bit, both with the Black Lives Matter movement, but also with COVID. But there's this incredibly idealized version of US society where we kind of think that everything functions better there, that institutions are better, that even on average, the life of the average African American or Latinx or Native American person is, or even Asian American person is better in the US. And I think that movement for Black lives has really kind of cracked that facade and said that, it's not acceptable that police kill and harm and arrest and detain people of color there at much more or at much higher levels and disproportionate levels than white people, but specifically also kill unarmed black men at the levels that they do. And that has, I think, in very many ways allowed other countries to also sort of introspect and say, so now we understand this about America. We've also known that there's this persistent level of police violence in our own countries, and we should be having that same conversation. If, and I think it's that thing of where a lot of people sort of comment on another country, and then you very quickly have to put up the mirror and say, but the same is happening in our country, or similar is happening in our country, and so we should be talking about it too. And I think that's exactly what's happened in South Africa. I think another really large catalyst for that was also Freeze Must Fall, and the other Must Fall movements, and Open Stellenbosch, which I know you were a part of as well, that also really revealed just how tight the connections are between institutions of power and elite institutions and the political and economic elite, how closely intertwined they are with the police, that actually this idea of community police service or police service for the people, that facade absolutely has to be cracked, and really for us to understand that the police are in very many ways a tool and a buffer that's used by those elites to really kind of keep themselves distant from the average person, but especially from the poor and working class. And again, there is no other more visceral example of exactly that than Marikana. The Marikana massacre really put forward to people this idea. And I mean, this was even before the Black Lives Matter movement that then came out of the US in 2014 after Michael Brown's death. But Marikana really was exactly that, I think, for us, just a really big catalyzing moment where we then understood that the police, on instruction from political and business elites, are actually very comfortable with murdering people who they then, believe are criminal, or that are, as our current president said at the time, are engaged in dastardly deeds of criminality. And so just based off of that they, can then enact brutal violence against people who are just at that point who were agitating for a living wage. And I think that really put a lot of us on notice, that if they're willing to do that, then they're willing to do it to pretty much anybody. And that I really think has catalyzed so much, has changed so much of our understanding of policing, but has also catalyzed a lot of our conversations around police brutality and police violence. And the fact that it's all sort of justified, even with the Farlam Commission, that the Farlam Commission, I think, again, incredibly important work that came out of that. But remembering that commissions of inquiry themselves are an old apartheid tool. They were used by the apartheid regime to essentially say, well, we'll investigate ourselves and we'll see what we did wrong, and then we'll hold ourselves accountable. And unfortunately, commissions of inquiry have become very much that, even in democratic South Africa. And in that sense, the Farlam Commission was precisely that, where it did the important work of uncovering exactly what happened over those fateful days in August 2012, but unfortunately then also provided political cover to not really do much else after that. Yeah. And so, all of those things, I think, really sort of come together in our understandings of the Black Lives Matter movement and the parallels with South Africa, but our own sort of processes and systems that have led to a point where we've really had to agitate and mobilize in very real ways, because we just know that the government isn't going to hold themselves accountable. Exactly.
And on that point of mobilization, on the point of protest action, and then how the police as this institution, as you say, that's main concern is protecting power, protecting capital, and how they then respond to protests. I really want to delve into that point a little bit more. You've mentioned Marikana, you've mentioned the Fees Must Fall movement, for example, as well, where we have seen the mere presence of police impacting the level of violence that we then see from protests that initially start out incredibly peaceful. And then the mere presence of the police then influencing outcomes of said protests. And you know, one of the closest references I personally have would be that of the Fees Must Fall movement, where university campuses across the country really leveraged their positionality to private security, for example, leveraged their positionality to powerful institutions like that of the police, even in some instances leveraged their positionality to the legal fraternity and the court system itself, and how students were treated in that you know, part of the criminal justice system, for example. So what we saw during that time on campuses across the world was police using force on student-led protests across the country. And here you specifically point out certain contradictions that also come into play when it comes to the policing of protests. And you also point out how it's very important to understand who is protesting and where they are protesting. And I think back to the example you made in your book where you said in Muizenberg in 2020 during the COVID-19 lockdown, where residents of Muizenberg, predominantly white middle-class residents of Muizenberg, were protesting the fact that they were not able to surf, that they were not able to make use of the beach and the ocean or whatever the case may be, right? Which really is not a basic human right. It's not a basic human need. You know, one could even classify surfing as a leisure activity. So very much a very privileged form of protest, right? But then there we see that the police, they are able to, in fact, police very peacefully. And then you contrast that to protests we see happening in Khayelitsha, for example, protests we've seen happening amongst Black students who were protesting these exorbitant fees that keep Black students excluded from tertiary education. And you see these direct contradictions depending on who it is that you are and where it is that you are engaging in civic action or fighting for the protection of your political and civic rights, right? So what does this contradiction really tell us about, you know, whose lives matter in South Africa, but also whose plight matters in South Africa, whose struggle matters, and who will then be afforded the political freedom to exercise your political rights?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think you've, set it up perfectly in that sense that there is this inherent sort of contradiction in the way that protests are and civic action are policed, but also that the way that the police themselves see different groups of people. And it's just so frustrating and it's deeply unjust. Again, that we just are served so many examples over and over and over again. And I, make reference to Senegal, where white farmers there were protesting what they saw as police and court inaction, against a murder of a farmer that happened there. That quickly turned to violence, and the police didn't react in the same way that we're used to seeing them when they react to a service delivery protest, for example. Same thing with Brackenfell, where you had different groups go and protest there of a racist incident that happened at Brackenfell High, and you really had what I can only describe as white vigilantes, come out with baseball bats. And there was even reports of at least one gun in one of the crowds at one point, and they were policed completely differently to how another group would be policed. And again, the classic sort of example of the Muizenberg beach protests, and more recently, all of the anti-vaxxer protests on the Sea Point Promenade, and just seeing wildly different images. And at this point, it's getting ridiculous. Like, it is getting so ridiculous that the police and their disdain for certain types of protesters, for certain groups, is so blatantly obvious. Yeah. And it's not just in Cape Town, it's in, every single part of the country. But it's just this, it's what I sort of talk about right in the beginning of the book, that we didn't do the work of excavating the racism from our police service. And so you still have those racist ideas of who is allowed to protest, who will inherently be violent when they protest, who will inherently be criminalized when they protest, and who then needs to be policed in a very forceful, brutal, excessive way that doesn't allow them to air their grievances, doesn't allow them to say, this is an issue that I care about and I want to be heard, and really closes down public space for debates in that way. And that's what it comes down to, is that who is allowed to partake in civic action that is and can be wholly peaceful, but who, then the police arrive and immediately escalate, to disrupt, to disperse, and to, essentially, really in a lot of ways, try to discourage from doing that again.
In your book, you talk about the sort of pipeline within the criminal justice system that sort of starts with, interactions with the police, goes into, issues around inaccessibility of the court system, as well as the racial bias within the court system. And then you end up deep sort of analyzing and discussing the history of prisons in South Africa. And, when you discuss the history of prisons, you spoke about how the prison or prisons were built as forced labor camps under colonialism, where prison labor was used for the development of like our roads, our railways, our farms, our mining industry in particular. And how this reinforces this capitalist exploitation of labor, and specifically Black labor. Mm-hmm. And then you also go on to sort of paint a picture of under apartheid, how prisons were these isolated spaces where people who were imprisoned were left to be unseen and unheard of, right? And you're very clear in your book that prisons were built for this purpose, that prisons were not necessarily built for this purpose then of delivering justice. Mm-hmm. And they also weren't built for the purpose of deterring crime, really. Nor was it built for the purpose of rehabilitating offenders. What is it about our prison system, in your opinion, that continues to reproduce and reinforce these violent norms and these systems and cultures of violence? And how does this sort of further entrench these racial hierarchies that we've been reflecting on today?
Yeah. So, immediately in answering that question, I definitely have to recognize the work of two abolitionists, Dr. Kelly Gillespie and Sohela Surajpal, who've both just done incredible work in terms of trying to unpack and again, smash this idea that we have of South African prisons as being part of, a justice system and not actually perpetuating injustice, which is what they've done in very, very many ways, especially in sort of, modern South Africa. I think that this idea that we have of justice, where we're locking up people, but also the very false perception that anybody who is in prison absolutely deserves to be there and they're terrible people, and in fact that there's no redeeming qualities to people who are in prison, is really, really misguided by the fact that we don't understand, firstly, how people end up in prison, and we don't understand who is in prison. So an incredibly illuminating fact for me was learning that about 27% of our prison population, and that's as of, I think, late 2019, about 27% of our prison population were people who, and are people who cannot afford bail, or who can't afford, or who can't meet bail conditions. And everybody thinks that bail is, money, but it's actually very many other factors. It's not being able to produce valid ID, and it's not being able to produce proof of residence. And if you're a poor person, you don't have, first of all, 500 Rand, 1,000 Rand, 1,500 Rand for bail. That's first and foremost. Then on top of that, it's very possible that you're undocumented. Very many South Africans, don't have, they maybe have a birth certificate, they maybe have an ID, but that's not a guaranteed for every single South African who's out there.
Yeah.
And it's even worse when you're somebody who's living in South Africa who's undocumented. And that's, also another part of the conversation that should be brought in. And then thirdly, it's, proof of residence. And I mean, this is has been such a contentious issue for a really, really long time. Because again, if you come from a very rural community, if you come from a low income or township community where there is no proper demarcation of your residence, of your street, you don't have an IRF number, you don't have an address, et cetera, or you're in a newly developed part of or growing part of a township, you don't have proof of address. There are so many people who that is a massive stumbling block for them for many other sort of things. And that becomes like a deep social injustice and socioeconomic injustice that lands people up in prison. So that's a quarter of the prison population that's there for not being for literally just being too poor for anything else. And then you have, so many others who are in prison who are there because they have drug problems. And a drug problem to me is a mental health and a public health issue. It's not actually a crime issue because you can't imprison, drug users and think that prison itself is going to be what gets them off of drugs. When people are dependent on drugs, there's very little that deters them. And so constantly cycling them through, the police, court and prison systems isn't going to help. And that's a really big part of it. And of course, there's a small section, I really do mean small section. I talk about in the book just how low convictions are for murders, for sexual offences, and for other types of violent crime. There's a small section that, of course, is those types of individuals. And I'm not necessarily saying that shut down prisons today and let all of them out free. But we really need to break this conception and this idea that that everybody who is in prison is there for a violent crime and that they are serving a long-term sentence. They really could be there for a vast majority of or vast variety of reasons. And so we really need people to confront their ideas and their perceptions of who's in prison, and then to really ask ourselves, how is that delivering justice?
Yeah.
How is that exactly how you were mentioning? How is that deterring crime? How is it rehabilitating people who are in prison? And how is it breaking cycles of violence and imprisonment?
Exactly. And I must say your book really did a great job at demystifying some of those myths. And I look specifically to this one statistic that you included in your book where you mentioned that as of May 2020, there were 43,000 people detained in prison as remand detainees, accused of crime and awaiting trial, guilty, and I'm quoting here from your book, guilty of nothing else except not being able to make bail conditions, sometimes for issues as minor as not having a proof of address, like you mentioned, or an ID. You also speak to how these conditions in prison, how they basically create and reinforce a socially excluded class of people who are then trapped in this vicious cycle, right? I just wanted to sort of, before we continue, I wanted for you to just reflect on, and you did this in your book, but for the purpose of those listening here today, reflect on how bad the prison, how bad the situation in prison really is. In the book, you speak, in depth about the inhumane conditions in many, if not all, of our South African prisons. How bad really is it? And what are our prospects for justice and equity in this regard?
Yeah. an incredibly illustrative example. And I remember reading this years ago. I think it was in 2014 or 2015. I remember I don't even know why I had read the article or what had sort of drawn me to it. But I remember reading a Daily Maverick article that was at that point sort of expose of what was happening at St. Albans prison in Port Elizabeth, or what we now know today as Gqeberha. And essentially they had spoken there about, I think it was either rabies or leprosy, but like this, really like old-timey, but like really intense public health issue that was happening in a prison. And you think, that rabies comes from rats and that leprosy comes from malnutrition. And you're just like, what? Like, this is a modern prison in South Africa after apartheid, where thousands of prisoners are crammed into completely overcrowded institution and don't have access to food, to proper nutrition, to safe and sanitary conditions. And this is how they're being detained. And again, people, that was just so incredibly illuminating for me, because in speaking to Suhela Surajpal, she had a really great point where she was like, people don't think about prisons because, again, they're isolated spaces, but we also have absolutely no empathy or feelings towards prisoners themselves, except for contempt. And so given that, you don't really think about them. They're kind of invisible. They're, not part of your... So I was just so sort of shocked out of that disinterest in prisons by that article. And that's actually really common. Yeah. Those public health crises and disease outbreaks within prisons are incredibly common. Pollsmoor is wildly overcrowded and has consistently had issues of rabies, of rat infestations, of TB outbreaks. COVID-19, of course, has absolutely flourished in prisons because they're congregate settings themselves and no one can social distance in them. And it really just is about saying, whatever you think of prisons, you actually really have to challenge that. There is no way that we can believe any of those conditions are humane. And then especially people, when they come out of the prison system, how on earth they're supposed to look at society or look at the world that they live in the same way. That if we're okay as a country for condemning people to that over and over and over again, and very many of them, particularly because they're poor, how on earth do we think that these are, functional people who will be able to reintegrate into our society? Yeah. And then, in fact, on top of that, we punish them for having gone to prison, even when they've served their time, or even when we say they've, quote unquote, served their debt to society. So they're just deeply unjust places. And we need to stop investing in this idea that prisons exist and only people who deserve to be there go there, and that even when they come out, just having been in prison, they've done something that is so morally wrong and abhorrent that we're actually going to turn from them every chance that we get.
Thanks so much for that, Ziyanda. I want to now kind of reflect on restorative justice. In your book, you put forward the idea of restorative justice as an alternative means for justice, a kind of mechanism that can work in conjunction with the criminal justice system as a whole. And in your book, when you speak about restorative justice, you mention it as a mechanism that could potentially make people, including those in prison, whole again. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you if you could perhaps reflect on what that really means for you, given how you've just now painted a scene of what it means to be imprisoned and the type of inhumane treatment many, more often than not, Black and colored men are subjected to in prison. What would restorative justice look like in that context, and how can we use restorative justice to make people whole again?
Yeah, I think that the idea of restorative justice, I think, really essential around this idea that, again, people are human and that in causing harm to someone else, they've also harmed themselves. There's a part of themselves that also, has been irrevocably changed by their behavior and by their sort of criminal behavior. But that doesn't mean that, that there's no way for them to be redeemed. There's no way for them to earn, the trust of their community, of their family members, or of their victims again. And so I think in that sense, sort of restorative justice in the way that it would look, I think, in South Africa, is the idea that, we want prisoners to, or people in prison to show remorse, to show contrition, and to show changed behavior, and that they've really, learned the error of their ways. That's something that I think could be deeply, deeply positive, not just for, the victims of crime and families of those victims, but also for people in prison themselves. I think we, see that so many people who've been in prison really express regret, for their actions, but also express regret that other actions have gotten them there. Yeah. That, the sort of crime that they end up in prison for is probably, part of a longer set of patterns and behaviors that they themselves wish that they could change or take back. And so I think we should really allow that space for people to express that regret and to say, I wish I could have done differently. I know that I can't now, but I can going forward. And that, I think, is really the part that helps to make people whole again. That, where they've caused harm and where they've harmed themselves as well, they're able to say, but I can change from this, I can learn from this, I can be better. And that really, bumps up against exactly what we're talking about in the previous question about, socially excluded class. Yeah. That challenges us as a society to then say, we don't condemn it, somebody who's been to prison and somebody who's done the work to really understand the harm that they've caused and to try and repair that harm. We don't then get to say to them that for years and years and years after that, but we still see you as a criminal. We still see you as that one act that you did or those many acts that you did, and we don't recognize the growth that you've made. And I think it's really important to understand that a lot of people who, again, end up in prison, vast majority of them being poor black and colored men, a lot of that also happens in their youth. And so that, when somebody is 20, 30, 40 years down the line, that they're a completely different person to who they were at the time, of a crime. And we really, really as a society need to reflect and take time to say, are we and through our prison system trying to enact revenge, or are we actually trying to rehabilitate people, trying to create good citizens again, and trying to say to people, you can reintegrate into society and you can learn from what you've done and you can find ways to repair the harm you've caused.
In your book, you drew our attention to the University of the Free State, and you looked at restorative justice approaches that were implemented there. And I really want us to reflect on some of those shortcomings. Of course, a very different context at a university and institutional level. And what we saw there was sort of an incident of racism by white students. Treating ground staff, treating workers at the university in such a way that is compromising of their human dignity and invalidating of their human dignity, right? And what we saw there was a restorative justice approach, which I think is one that should be met with the critique you met it with. Could you perhaps just a little bit reflect on, what happened at the Rates residence at UFS firstly, and then secondly, reflect on those shortcomings in the institution's leadership's responses to using so-called restorative justice in the community, and whether or not that is a clear example of the sort of disproportionate implementation of restorative justice that we see within our society.
Yeah. I think that a crucial element of restorative justice or successful, sort of manifestations of that justice is also recognizing that there are disproportionate or that there are levels of power and privilege that also come into play. So another example that I talk about in the book is the case of B.S. LaRue, who is a quite a wealthy professional rugby player at the time, and he was caught for drunk driving by a traffic officer, and through really a confrontation that immediately turned violent. He then beat the traffic officer who stopped him to death, and he had claimed at the time he felt very unsafe, and he was drunk also. So in that case, what essentially happened was that he was able to reach a plea bargain. And those are things that exist within the South African justice system, but aren't used very often. But he was able to reach a plea bargain with the traffic officer's family, the deceased family, and he, paid out a monetary amount, and he acknowledged his wrongdoing, and was then able to avoid jail time. And so I think similarly to the rates incident, both of those incidents for me show that there were disproportionate levels between perpetrator and victim, and so in that sense, we have to be really cognizant when we're practicing restorative justice, or when we promote the idea of restorative justice, that people are not on equal playing terms at all. These were working class employees of the university, and wealthy white students at UFS, who then were placed on the same level, and I don't think deeply cognizant enough. The university's leadership was deeply, cognizant enough of firstly, of that unequal playing field, but then secondly, what that case also meant for the wider university community, but our own whole society, where, we're essentially saying that the futures of these 5 white students, to me, were placed at a premium, and the human dignity and the harm and the suffering and emotional distress that was caused to, the working class employees of the university wasn't really adequately met in very many ways. And I mean, interestingly, I draw on the book quotes from Jessica Taylor. She's I think a sociology student who wrote her master's thesis and therefore interviewed very many of the employees, but also some of the white students. And she, said that in her interviews with the employees especially, they came out of the process at least having felt heard and having felt that their human dignity was again reassured and really sort of reaffirmed in very many ways. Whereas at least one of the white students expressed the fact that, they felt victimized by the process, because actually in their eyes, by trying to equal that playing field and trying to equal where both parties were coming from, especially using this approach of restorative justice, that they were somehow impugned, by that action. So it's if we're not cognizant of the disparate nature of our society, of the deep sort of structural natures of power, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's racial, whether it's class power, if we're not cognizant of those things, then is that really restorative? Is it really? Are we making people whole? Are we really making people cognizant of the harm that they've caused? And are we really making sure that they, repair that harm? So it's I think, a really, really great approach and could do wonders, I think, for South African society. But if we try and deal with it almost at a vacuum, then, it won't work. Then what are we doing?
Yeah, exactly. Ziyanda, in your book, you present a big and bold abolitionist future for South Africa. I want to know from you, what exactly does that look like? What does justice in that sense look like for you?
That's a really good question. I mean, I try and tackle it over 2 chapters because it is actually really, really complicated. It's not it's not super easy. I think that so in the book I very early on, I sort of talk about the Freedom Charter and how that had mapped out a vision for our entire society. And I think that sometimes we forget that the Freedom Charter itself was a manifestation, not a manifestation, but an imagination of a whole of society change for South Africa, that everything about South Africa would have to change. This was written in 1955. And we can definitely say that there's so much about South Africa that obviously and clearly has changed since 1955. But the Freedom Charter itself was so deliberate in this and articulate in this vision for South Africa that was changed on every single level, and that included prisons, police, and the court system. And so, if we're so much of our idea of South African society, especially the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, were heavily influenced by the Freedom Charter. And so, if we're looking for a guide and if we're looking for a way forward in a way that's better, I can't think of a better sort of guide from except for the Freedom Charter. So in that sense, I think it's also about recognizing that the Freedom Charter really spoke about prisons especially as being a place, not of revenge and not of punishment, but of rehabilitation. So that's one part of it. And particularly where people who, I think the exact quote from the Charter is, people who have caused harm against the people. That's where the criminal justice system, and that's the role and the place of the criminal justice system. And that's really important because it takes away all of this, property damage and, all of these other things that we've held on to because they actually have a deeply capitalist approach and nature to them. And again, that deep and insidious connection between the elites, whether they're political or economic elites, and capitalist interests, as well as our criminal justice system, that really starts to fall away because at the end of the day, what becomes the most important issue is that those who commit or those who perpetrate harm against the people themselves, like that's what the criminal justice system is there for, is to really rehabilitate those people. And I go into it very honestly, especially the final chapter of the book, by saying that I'm also not super convinced by abolition. And I think that was very much because I sort of saw and understood abolition as an American concept. But once I think you kind of look at the Freedom Charter itself and what that would be, I think, today identified as a radical and abolitionist view and vision of society, I think it's super important to think of abolition, but in a really contextualized and practical way too. And that's what I try and do, sort of talking about the fact that we still need a capable state. Like if we're kind of talking about abolition and we're talking about creating communities of care, we can't just kind of excuse government and be like, we'll take care of this as communities. Like government has to step up and meet people's basic needs to help, prevent a situation where people are pushed into crime because they feel like they have no other way to, again, meet their basic needs or to survive. Yeah. Exactly. So that's a big part of it. I think the other part of it is the private security sector. I mean, that is a sector of our economy that essentially is worth 45 billion rand a year. It's massively, hugely profitable for the companies that are in it, and that employs, and I actually want to say exploits, 500,000 people, across the country. And, everybody could say, well, they employ, people who would otherwise not have a job, da-da-da-da. Well, it's, again, mostly working class black people who are not paid very well at all, again, who are put in harm's way and who, will likely occupy very low-level positions for the entire time that they're in that employment. So is it really a good thing? I would argue no. And that's a really practical sort of consideration of any abolitionist future that we have for South Africa, that we, can't work towards abolition while having a parallel private security sector. And again, a sector that engages in racial stereotyping, that engages in the harmful use of artificial intelligence and surveillance, in many communities, that engages in very many unjust practices, and that also will never self-regulate. It won't. It simply won't. It's too profitable for them to ever really put in any regulations other than those that, are cosmetic in very many ways. So it's I think, about having an abolitionist vision for South Africa, but understanding that that there have to be incredibly practical ways to get there, and ways that are contextualized for our own understanding of our society, but also for where we're at. Yeah. That I think that because of our high crime and high violent crime levels, it's really going to take a lot of persuasion and a lot of work to get from where we are to a point where we at least have gotten to the point where we've shrunk down the police, the court, and the prison system to much smaller levels of what they are. Again, given, and this is a huge point that I make in the book, again, given how much money we spend on that system, we just pour money into that system, and it delivers so little, so little, and barely any justice.
Thanks for that. And segueing off some of your points, you write explicitly on the decriminalization of not only drug use but also of sex work as key public policy positions, and also as pathways into abolition for our society. Could you perhaps just sort of reflect on why the decriminalization of drug use and then also of sex work, why those are such critical factors for us to consider in this conversation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that firstly, the decriminalization of sex work is an incredibly sort of key part of where we need to be going. And this is something that incredible organizations like Sonke Gender Justice and the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Task Force have been working towards for a long time, because also a large number of people who experience police violence and who are exposed to police brutality over and over again are sex workers. And so if we're ever going to have justice for them, we need to get to a point where, and I don't think it's enough to, have police officers be more sensitive to sex workers. It's that so many have such deeply harmful prejudices against sex workers that that they're almost incapable, really, of seeing sex workers as people who can be victims of crime themselves. Yeah. But secondly, many of them see them as sort of ATMs, in the sense that they will go out of their way to harass them, and then essentially say, if you want me to stop harassing you, you need to pay me a bribe, or that they then solicit sexual favors from them, and it's just so unbelievably harmful. It also just makes no sense. Yeah. It makes absolutely no sense. For us to say that that there's that this group or class of people is going to be stigmatized, and we allow them to experience police violence at incredibly high levels, but then also that somehow that violence will stay with just sex workers. I mean, that's how police officers again have incredibly harmful views. Also, when people come in to report gender-based violence, because they have those views of sex workers and sex work, that then bleeds into the work that they deal with, with other victims of gender-based violence. So that's one big important part of it. And secondly, around drug use, as I said earlier, I see drug use as a social problem. I see it as a public health problem. I see it as a mental health problem. And so treating it as a criminal problem, all it does is it swells our prison population. Yeah. It absolutely clogs up the court system with minor sort of drug offences and trying to catch people for those minor drug offences. But it never actually gets to the heart of dismantling, actual crime networks and empires that are built on drug trafficking. And so if we were actually able to say, take the minor drug users out of the equation and understand that needs to be dealt with on completely separate levels, with psychosocial support, with just getting people jobs and work and productive, activities that they can take part of, then we can get to the fact that they are big kingpins who are making enormous amounts of money off of really harmful practices of drug use. And that's, who the criminal justice system should be targeting, not minor drug users. Exactly.
Thank you so much for that point. I'm almost upset that we are nearing the end of this conversation, because I have learned so much in just this conversation with you, building off of what I've learned while engaging and reading your book. I have two last burning questions that I absolutely have to pick your brain on. The first being, what do you hope people take away from reading and engaging with your work, and even those who will be listening to this conversation online, what are the key messages you hope people walk away with in such a way that it not only, I suppose, changes how it is we think about these things, but also inspires people into action, into actually finding ways to be part of solutions to some of these critical issues?
Yeah. I really so badly just want people to completely rethink everything they know about policing, and by extension, then rethinking what sort of deeply held beliefs of our court and prison systems, and really to even just rethink the concept of justice. Like, what is justice? What do we want to see as justice? What do we understand as justice? And how do we then try and tackle injustice? So that's a really big part of it, that just go into it with an open mind, read the whole book. There are probably tons of parts you won't agree with. That's fine. That's the whole point. But also then be intellectually curious. I mean, there's so many references that I have in the book. Read those people too. Read differing opinions. Just challenge yourself and allow yourself to say, what we have now doesn't work. How are we going to change it? But also, what approaches, seem like there's actually a way out of this, because I think there's again, I speak about it again in the book as well, that there's so many politically and economically profitable sort of ways to exploit our fears and our insecurities, and our feelings of unsafety, and that also needs to be questioned. Don't just take the word of any politician who says to you, you feel unsafe, and I'm the only one who can change that, and I will do it by doing X, Y, and Z, or same with private security and the solutions that they sell you, and really just sort of question the motives behind that. And I think that once you do all of those things, then it really does become incumbent on the person who's read the book and who's listened to this conversation to go, how can I make a contribution, however big or small, to exactly these ways, the ways in which we can start to dismantle, not dismantle per se the criminal justice system, but how we can start to dismantle the punitive logics of it that really punish people, and that have nothing to do with the prevention of crime, that really are just there for punishment and not prevention. And that's not what we need to be, constantly cycling through and perpetuating and then reproducing.
My last question to you, Ziyanda, and this is now where we sort of close off our discussion, but definitely not the last discussion. I most definitely will be inviting you back for further, debate and discussion, perhaps even with more voices in the room. I think that would really make things really interesting and really enrich this conversation even more so. But my last question to you go around, and you've touched on this already, around future intentions for your research and how you would like your research to be used going forward. And specifically in this context that we exist in, where we continue to see social upheaval, social unrest, but also seeing social movements and social mobilizations coming together to really, fight and stand up for justice, stand up for the protection of human dignity, and really cash in on some of the promises that we were promised in our transition from apartheid to democracy. And here we sit 27 years later and we're still fighting very, very similar fights, right? How would you like for the research that you've put out? How would you like for that to be used going forward as we continue to see these struggles, whether they be socioeconomic struggles and even political struggles in this turbulent and uncertain political climate that we find ourselves in?
Yeah. I mean, I hope that what this book does is that it refocuses attention on the police service. I think that for a really long time, and incredibly, lockdown was able to do this more than anything else. But refocus our attention on the police service and just how much of it is unstable, unsustainable, structurally, if I may use the word, fucked up. And so how we have to, essentially create a system and a structure and an institution that works so much better for so many more people. And I think a really, again, important point to make here is the fact that we need to also do that for police officers who are on the job, who are put into unbelievably impossible situations and dangerous situations over and over and over again. They're being failed by the institution just as much as we are, as the average South African is. And they deserve a place to work and a place to be in society and work that is fulfilling to them and that is contributing in really positive ways. So that's I think an important aspect of this too, and that's, you know, again, about centering the human aspect of the police service and institution. So I really hope that very many civil society organizations who engage with this book and sort of then reflect on their own work and how that's contributing to crime prevention, but also contributing to a world where we won't need to rely on, you know, a huge, chunky, bulky, dysfunctional, expensive criminal justice system to deliver that, that justice or that social justice or economic or racial justice. And I also hope that it allows, you know, professionals who are thinking of going into the legal profession, for example, or who are thinking of and who aspire to be part of many of the other sort of auxiliary services around crime and policing, to also reflect why they're there, reflect on why they're there, and reflect on how they can sort of move things forward past this, sort of basic function of a police service, but rather to a service or to a legal or part of the legal fraternity that, again, is caring and that is around sort of building communities of care, but also building a society and practice and institutions within which people aren't trapped and cycled in and out of over and over again and exposed to high levels of crime, injustice, violence, and brutality.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ziyanda. I honestly cannot thank you enough for taking the time to come and chat with us today. It's been an incredible discussion, one of many, I hope. And I will most definitely be taking a lot of the things that I've learned here today back to some of my colleagues who work in the social justice and transitional justice sector and sharing some of these critical learning moments with them and potentially with broader members of society as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. This was such a great conversation. You asked amazing questions.
I'm glad you thought so. I'm really glad you thought so, because your book was so all-encompassing and so entirely comprehensive that it was almost difficult to pinpoint certain themes and topics that we really wanted to highlight in this discussion. So the goal was really to do it justice, really.
Yeah, you definitely did.
I'm happy to hear that. I hope those listening really enjoyed this discussion. Mm-hmm. Ziyanda, how can people stay in touch with your work? What are some of your social media handles that we can, continue to follow your work going forward?
Yeah, well, look, I'm like high-key addicted to Twitter. So you can definitely follow me on @Ziyanda S_. I sort of try and write fairly regularly, for the Mail and Guardian and for other platforms. I'm also, honestly, mostly through sort of Twitter. But at the same time, I put out publications. Fairly recently, put out a publication for Afrobarometer on trust in the police. So I try and write and sort of put out things quite often. And there's a fair amount of podcast recordings as well that I've done, about this book, but other sort of issues around crime and safety. And lastly, please buy the book. Yes. Please go to your local bookstore, whichever that is, and buy the book or go online, and you can get it from Take a Lot, Exclusive Books, Loot, all of those places.
Yeah, you definitely won't be disappointed. As I've said, it was one of the best reads I've had in a while. And you'll definitely enjoy the read and also just learn so much about where we've come from, where we are, and also about where it is that we're going as a society. Lastly, thank you to our listeners for tuning in and for engaging in this conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time out to listen in. And lastly, thanks to Mother City Audio in Woodstock, our sound engineers who have assisted us in the recording and editing of this podcast. We really appreciate your service and your partnership in this regard. And we look forward to many more conversations of this nature.
Many more, for sure.
With that, I bid you all farewell and goodbye.